Hello, welcome to Tobisonics. It is Tuesday, the 15th of June, 2021. I hope you all had great weekends and you've had an opportunity to enjoy the summer sun. In this week's episode, we're going to do something a little bit different from our usual topics. We're going to take a look at how you prepare and send multi-tracks to a mix engineer. Let's start by talking quickly about the difference between multi-tracks and stems. Now, these two terms are often used interchangeably, but in fact they are different, particularly in terms of their application. Let's start with stems because that tends to be the word that you hear most nowadays. Typically, stems are groups of tracks that have been grouped together by type into different stereo files. So you'd have one stereo file, that's your bass. You'd have a second stereo file, that's all your drums. You'd have another stereo file, those are your guitars. Another one would be your keys or your synths. Then you'd have another one for percussion, perhaps some backing vocals, and then one for your vocals. Typically, stems are used for if you're going to do a remix, or sometimes you might use them for stem mastering. Multi-tracks, on the other hand, are the individual instruments and voices within your production. So instead of having all the drums bust together onto one stereo track like you'd have with a stem, you're going to have individual tracks for the kick, the snare, toms, hi-hat, cymbals, etc. And you're going to do that for all the different instruments. And the reason you're going to do that is it gives your mix engineer access. It allows them to do their job properly. It allows them to work within the individual dynamics, the EQ, of all the different voices and instruments in your production. If you just send them stems, you're going to limit their ability to bring the best out in your production. A mix engineer really does need the multi-tracks to do their job properly. As you know, I like to keep things as tangible as possible, so we're going to be using the production for my new single, All the Little Things, and we're going to be looking at how I exported those multi-tracks to my mix engineer. Before we get into it, if you could just take a moment to like this video and subscribe to my channel, that would really help me out. Thank you for taking the time. The first thing that we need to do is we need to check that our production is ready to be sent to the mix engineer. And that means we need to check all the plugins on each of the individual channels. We need to check that nothing's in bypass. We need to make sure that any automation that we're using has been activated and is working. We also need to check any plugins that are using oversample. Are we going to max out that oversample? If we do that, is that going to make it difficult for our CPU to print all the multi-tracks? Do we need to freeze some tracks? Free up a little bit of CPU resources. And finally, you also need to check that none of your plugins are clipping. So you need to go through your signal chains and make sure that you're not clipping at any place. You don't want any distortion creeping into your production. The next thing we've got to look at is track names. We need to make sure that the names are intuitive and that we are consistent in the way that we're naming them. So for example, I like to use octave up and below to stack my kicks, to give a little bit more weight and a little bit more top. So I'm going to have -1 octave kick, mid kick, and +1 octave kick. And I'm going to do that consistently. So if I have different kick drums through the same production, I'm going to label them that same way so that the mix engineer can see that and he's used to the way I'm doing it. If I start changing the way I'm labeling things, even though it might make sense to me, it's going to confuse the mix engineer. And I don't want that because I want him to be able to get on with his job as quickly and as easily as possible so he can maximize what I've done with the production. Here we are in the export audio mixdown window in Cubase, and I've called up the naming scheme option. Now, I don't want to get into the whys and wherefores of Cubase too much because you're all going to be on different DAWs. I'm just going to concentrate on what we're doing with the actual naming system itself. What this allows me to do, in addition to the channel names that I've already got set up within the production itself, it allows me to add additional labels across all the different tracks. And the first thing I like to do, here we go, channel number. I like to start with that. Why do I do it that way? Well, because otherwise the multi-tracks are going to print out in alphabetical order, and that is not the order that I'm using them in the production, and it's not going to make a lot of sense for the mix engineer. They're going to have to spend time sorting out all the different tracks into an order that makes sense. If I use the channel number, that's going to make the multi-tracks print out in the order I have them in the production. After the channel number, I then have the channel name, and that is the channel name as it appears in your production. So it's going to go 01, lead vocal, 0 to vocal dub or vocal saturation or vocal reverb or whatever it is. You get the idea. Finally, I like to use what's called the free text option in Cubase. Now, you may have a different way of doing this in your DAW, but there'll be some way for you to be able to write in a series of labels or information or data or whatever you want to call it that's just going to be consistent and printed on every single channel. Let's have a look at what I like to put on those multi-tracks. Let's double click in and let's see what we've got in here. So the first thing I've got, artist name, T-Sonics, Tobisonics. Then I've got the title, which I've just abbreviated to all the little things, ATLT. Next up, I like to have the BPM, 122, and the key, B minor. And then I've got the bit depth and bit rate. So I've got 32 float, 48 kilohertz. Why do I do that? Artist name and track name, really simple. In case some of the multi-tracks get misplaced, it's really easy for them to be able to find them. They can just do a simple search and they're going to pop straight up. They're going to know what they are. BPM, really straightforward, allows the mix engineer to set their session to the right BPM before they import the tracks. And key, well, some mix engineers are going to care about this and some of them aren't. It's going to depend on how they like to work. Some of them might want to tune some of the percussion or drums. They may want to EQ according to musical note. They may even feel that they need to change the pitch of something. They may want to pitch something up or pitch it down or shift something before they put it through a reverb. Knowing the key of the track makes it much, much easier for them to do that. And finally, bit depth and bit rate. Again, really straightforward, very obvious, so they can set their session to the correct setup before they bring it in. Okay, there's one last thing that we have to do before we're ready to export our tracks, and that is set our start and end points. The simplest way to set your start point is to take this and there you go, right at the beginning of the timeline. When you set your endpoint, it's really important that firstly, you make sure you get all of the tracks all the way to the end of the tracks. I know it sounds obvious, but it's really easy just to cut off the end. But the second thing you need to do is make sure that you leave a little extra space to the end just to catch any reverb tails or ambience or little delays. Make sure that you've got all of that so you're not suddenly cutting the track dead. So here we go, let's have a look at this. We're a little bit close to the end of the tracks here. So the way I'd like to do that, I like to use the arranger track in Cubase. You could do this in any number of ways. We're just gonna draw in, let's draw in an extra 8 bars. There you go. And we can just move that along to there, and there you go. Now we've got a consistent endpoint, plenty of room for any reverb tails, delays, what have you. Now we're ready to export our tracks. So here we are, we're back in the export audio mixdown window in Cubase. Remember, it's going to be a little bit different with your DAW. I'm not going to get into the hows and whys of Cubase too much. I'm just going to go through the principles of it because they'll be the same regardless of what DAW you're using. So the first thing we need to do is make sure that we're set up for a multi-track export. And this is going to be pretty simple. We can just kind of go through and select every track we want. This is also a good opportunity to check that your names make sense and also that there aren't any dead tracks because your mix engineer doesn't know if that track's muted or if there's something gone wrong in the signal processing. They're going to have to check with you. Again, that's time that they are not spending on your production, making it sound as good as possible. It's time that they're trying to sort things out with you. Now I work at 32 float 48 and that's what I want the mix engineer to work at, so that's what I want to export the multi-tracks at. So I'm going to change that up, 32 float, that way both myself and the mix engineer are working at 32 float. I get the mix comes back to me at 3248 and then I master it at 3248. Now we're ready to go, it's time to export our audio. And what I like to do is make sure that I've got a real-time export selected here and then we're ready to click on the audio and export the audio. Finally, I like to do 2 types of print for my mix engineer. I like to do a production print where all the multi-tracks are set at the levels I have them in the production. And then I also like to do a unity print where I set all the multi-tracks to 0 on the fader. So everything's right up there. So the mix engineer has full access to the reverbs, the delays, any thickening processing I've got, any individual layers of instruments that might be there. But if they need to, they can also go back to the production print so they know the reference level that I use for a particular reverb setting, a particular thickening setting, etc., etc., etc. It gives them a full range of options. The most important thing to remember when you're printing multitracks is that you're trying to make it as easy as possible for your mix engineer to do the job. You don't want your mix engineer to be wasting their time trying to figure out what track goes where, or what's in sync, or what this track's for, or is this track muted, or did they forget, or did they export it by accident? You want them focused on making your production sound as good as possible. If you enjoyed this week's episode, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to my channel. It really does help me out. Thank you for taking the time. The production from this week's video, All the Little Things, is out right now on all streaming platforms and Bandcamp. Please, please, please check it out, have a listen, let me know what you think in the comments below or via social media at Tobisonics. Thank you so much for watching, and until next Tuesday, good night and good noise, stay safe and stay healthy.
See it all glorious microscopic.